Whenever the topic of supernatural events comes up, there's one profession that inevitably comes to mind: the Taoist priest. In our impression, ghost hunting seems to have become an exclusive skill of Taoist priests. In horror movies, as long as a Taoist priest appears, we can't help but feel a sense of relief. It's safe to say that, in the eyes of most people, the profession carries a positive image. However, as a religion that has existed for thousands of years, it's not without its share of unscrupulous individuals, those who resort to theft, fraud, or even worse crimes for personal gain. Due to the nature of their profession, when they do commit wrongdoing, it's often hard to detect. Today's story is about a Taoist priest and involves some unsettling elements. If you feel uncomfortable, please stop reading at any time. To make it easier for everyone to follow, the story will be narrated in the first person. In 2007, I accidentally came into contact with a mysterious sect. It was a branch of Taoism and considered a relatively large faction, with its main altar located in Jiangsu. However, its disciples were spread across various regions, primarily in the south. Since ancient times, this sect has been renowned for its air of mystery. Tales of their supernatural abilities, like walking through walls or turning stone into gold, abound in history. I had watched documentaries and animations about them as a child, and during my time studying under my master, I often heard him and other seniors mention them. I deeply understood that this sect was not to be disturbed lightly. Due to the sect's size and the wide distribution of its followers, there were inevitably a few bad apples, selfish individuals who caused harm to others by using spirits for their own gain. Although I am not a Taoist myself, I understand that anyone who acts against the moral principles of Taoism is bound to face divine retribution. However, such retribution often comes late. That year, by chance, I had my first real-life encounter in combating such forces. My opponent was one of these rogue Taoists, someone who had lost all regard for laws and morality. It was shortly after the Lunar New Year, and the weather was still quite cold. I'm not a morning person, especially in the winter. Once I'm snug in bed, I hate getting up early. But that day, I forgot to turn off my phone before going to bed, so early in the morning, I received an anxious call from a woman. On the other end of the line, her voice was choked with sobs as she begged me to save her daughter. I tried to calm her down and get her to explain the situation more clearly, but she was too distraught to speak coherently. After a long, fragmented explanation that I couldn't make sense of, I had no choice but to ask her to come to my house to explain in person. After giving her my address, I got up and washed quickly. Knowing she must be in great distress, I didn't want to waste any time. I had a quick breakfast and waited for her arrival. She came shortly after. As soon as I opened the door, she knelt at my doorstep and pleaded, "Master, please save my daughter. You must save her." Then she burst into tears. This wasn't the first time someone had come to me like this. Many who sought my help would kneel and cry at my door as soon as I opened it. A few neighbors had even witnessed such scenes before, leading me to suspect there were all sorts of rumors about me in the neighborhood, perhaps even wild ones claiming I was some kind of love sorcerer, given the dramatic scenes at my door. But instead of reacting, I simply met those speculations with a cold smile, indifferent yet composed, letting my charisma do the talking. The woman kneeling before me appeared to be slightly older than I was. Judging by her age, I guessed her daughter was probably between 4 and 7 years old. I couldn't let her keep kneeling just to make myself look important, so I quickly helped her up and invited her inside. That's when I noticed there was a man behind her, slightly older, likely in his 40s. He had been standing to the side when I opened the door, so I hadn't seen him at first. I assumed he was either her husband or her brother. The man's expression was much more composed, even skeptical, which made me think he had only come along because of the woman. It seemed he wasn't particularly convinced about what I do, but that didn't bother me. Over the years, I'd grown accustomed to facing doubtful looks. Another skeptic didn't make a difference. As long as they were respectful, I didn't take offense. Once they were seated, I poured them some tea to help calm their nerves. I sat across from them and asked the woman to explain what had happened to make her so distressed. She began to tell her story. Her surname was Shui, and she was 30 years old. She had married at 25 and given birth to fraternal twins, a boy and a girl, who were now 5 years old. Life had been happy and harmonious for their family until tragedy struck. When the twins were not yet 3, her husband was killed in a motorcycle accident. This loss was a devastating blow to the family. Fortunately, the twins were too young to fully grasp what had happened. Ms. Xue left her children in the care of her parents in their hometown and moved to the city to work. Being young and hardworking, she quickly gained her boss's favor and was promoted to manage a large district. Her new position brought her into contact with many people, one of whom was her current boyfriend. She gestured toward the man who had accompanied her and introduced him as Mr. Wei, a businessman in the spare parts industry. Mr. Wei had been divorced with no children and was willing to accept Ms. Xue's 2 kids as his own. Ms. Xue found him reliable and decided to introduce him to her parents and children during the 2007 Spring Festival. The visit went well, her family liked Mr. Wei, and the twins quickly warmed to him. Ms. Xue was overjoyed and began planning for a modest wedding after, which she would bring her children to live with her in the city, completing their family. But shortly after returning to work, tragedy struck again. Ms. Xue's mother called to inform her that her daughter, the elder twin, had hanged herself in the pigsty. Her body was only discovered the next morning by her grandfather. This devastating news shattered Ms. Xue's world. She and Mr. Wei immediately returned to her hometown. After the burial, strange incidents began to occur, leading Ms. Xue to seek my help. I can completely understand Ms. Xue's feelings. As a woman, experiencing such a drastic change in just a few short years is unimaginable. If not for her child, I believe she might have collapsed entirely. So, in that moment, I decided I had to help her, no matter how much the commission would be. I simply wanted to assist this poor woman and her broken family. However, after listening to her tearful story, I found a few details that didn't quite add up. First of all, although Ms. Xue's hometown isn't located in the urban center, it's still in a semi-rural area. Even with some forests and farmland around, it's not desolate enough to be plagued by wild animals or stray dogs capable of digging up a child's grave. Second, why did this incident happen specifically after the Lunar New Year, and more importantly, on the 7th day after the child's death, when the body was exposed in the wilderness? Third, as Ms. Xue mentioned, her daughter was only 5 years old. No matter how inappropriate television content might be, it couldn't possibly teach a child of that age to hang herself. Moreover, choosing to hang herself in a pigsty, a place obviously meant to avoid being seen, was far beyond the intellectual capacity of a 5-year-old. I felt that something was very suspicious about this case. Even as I agreed to help Ms. Xue, I had little confidence in solving the mystery. But I had a nagging feeling that there was a sinister plot behind this tragedy. The most likely explanation, as Ms. Xue suggested, was that her family had been cursed. I knew I had to handle this matter with utmost care. So I told Ms. Xue, "Let's go. Take me to your hometown right now." Mr. Wei, a businessman, drove a car worth approximately 400,000 yuan. Feeling it would be impolite to suggest taking my own car, I decided to ride with him instead. Plus, since he knew the route, it saved me from the hassle of navigating and possibly getting lost. After we got in the car, I noticed a pendant made of ox bone hanging from his rearview mirror. It was engraved with a symbol that seemed vaguely familiar. Curious, I asked him about it. Mr. Wei explained that he had obtained the charm years ago during a trip to a Taoist mountain in Jiangsu. At the time, he didn't put much stock in such things and never wore it. But after the tragedy at Ms. Xue's house, he retrieved it and hung it in his car for protection. It took about 40 minutes to drive from my home to the town near Ms. Xue's village. From there, it was another 40 minutes to her house. By the time we arrived, it was already midday. I told them, "Take me to your daughter's burial site now." I suggested that Mr. Wei accompany me instead of Ms. Xue, as I didn't want her to endure the pain of revisiting the site. He instructed Ms. Xue's future in-laws to look after her, and then he led me up the mountain. It was a small hill, and along the way we passed through a pine forest. On some of the branches there were yellow paper charms resembling ancient coins. They had likely been scattered when the child was buried. There were indeed very few houses in the area, and the dense pine canopy blocked most of the sunlight. Combined with the scattered paper offerings, the forest exuded an eerie atmosphere. After walking east along the path for about 10 more minutes, Mr. Way stopped at a relatively open clearing and said, "This is where she was buried." I looked down at the burial site, feeling a pang of sadness. In a small depression between several large rocks, there was a freshly heaped mound of dirt, a small grave. As Mr. Way had described, the soil was packed tightly. I knelt down and scattered some rice over the grave. Then I dipped my fingers in water and flicked it onto the ground. Taking out my compass, I prepared to determine whether the child's soul was indeed suffering in the afterlife. It was a judgment call. If a ghost's emotions were positive, the direction and frequency of the compass needle's movement would differ from those of a ghost consumed by anger or pain. However, strangely enough, the compass showed no reaction at all. This shouldn't have been the case. According to Sister Shui, on the 7th night after the child's death, her son told her that his sister was calling him, saying she was in great pain. This clearly indicated the presence of a ghost. Moreover, the event occurred on the 7th night, but according to custom, a soul begins to roam starting at midnight on the 7th day and remains for 49 days. This means that within those 49 days, even if a ghost doesn't manifest, the soul still exists. Yet, my compass remained completely unresponsive, a phenomenon I had never encountered before. It was deeply unsettling. I was baffled and began to feel a growing sense of fear, unsure of the kind of sinister scheme I had stumbled into. Then, I suddenly remembered something my mentor had told me. In the Yunnan Miao region, there were places where children who died young were buried hastily with no gravestones or proper burial rites. These children, considered to lack sufficient spiritual cultivation, were not regarded as fully human. Unlike here, they couldn't have incense burned or be worshipped. Without such rituals, these children became wandering spirits, unclaimed and forlorn. As a result, ghostly occurrences were particularly common in that region, most of them involving the spirits of these children. My mentor had advised me that if I ever encountered such a situation, I should ask for the child's name and carve it onto a wooden plaque to be buried with them. This way, the child would know their name and not remain a wandering ghost. The plaque would also ensure that underworld officials could guide them to reincarnation. My mentor explained that this method was, in essence, a way for the child to report their name to the King of Hell, avoiding the fate of being sent to hell as an unnamed, unregistered soul. Thinking of this, I turned to Mr. Way and asked, was the child buried clothed or unclothed? He replied that the child had been dressed. I followed up, what kind of clothing? He said it was a red cotton jacket. My heart sank. Dressing the deceased in red is a major taboo. Coupled with the absence of a name plaque and the possibility that the child had taken her own life, conducting a proper ritual to release her spirit would be extremely challenging. With this in mind, we returned to Sister Shui's home. I shared my analysis and conclusions with her family. However, at this point, it was impossible to exhume the child's body to change her clothing and add a name plaque. Such an act would be a grave disrespect to the deceased, potentially exacerbating the situation. Not only might her spirit remain restless, but I could also end up being haunted myself. I was at a loss for what to do. I needed absolute calm to think things through, so I told Sister Shui's family, "It seems I'll have to stay at your house tonight. Don't worry about me. Just let me work on figuring this out." To me, Sister Shui's family and Mr. Way were clients, people I was destined to help. To them, I was their last hope, their lifeline. They didn't hesitate to accommodate me, quickly preparing a small room for me to stay in. Burdened by the predicament, I had no choice but to go back up the mountain alone, circling the area near the child's grave multiple times. I held the compass until my hands grew sore, but no clues emerged. I couldn't call my mentor for help either. He had retired, and any interference on his part could invite strange disturbances. So, I wandered aimlessly on the mountain until dusk, then made my way back to Sister Shui's house. As soon as I entered the courtyard, I heard Sister Shue wailing, "Choo choo! Choo choo!" My stomach churned. Choo choo must be the little girl's name. Yet even knowing this, I couldn't exhume her grave again to place a name plaque inside. Worse still, I couldn't even locate her spirit. It was as if she were a lost child, desperate to be found, but the more I searched, the more elusive she became. Avoiding Sister Shue's heart-wrenching gaze, I slipped into the room they had prepared for me, deciding to skip dinner. Alone, I repeatedly tried to piece together the scattered clues, but they remained fragmented and incomplete. My thoughts wrestled with the puzzle until late at night. It must have been past 1 a.m. when I, half asleep, heard a faint scratching at the door. The sound wasn't loud, but I clearly identified it as coming from my room. I initially thought someone from Sister Shue's family needed something and had locked the door, so I got up to open it. When I opened the door, I saw Sister Shue's son standing there, his face blank, his eyes staring straight at me. Startled, I was about to ask him what he wanted when I suddenly realized this child must have been possessed. Instinctively, I stepped back, but he advanced toward me, step by step. As I retreated to the bedside, I felt under the pillow for the red rope. If he came any closer, I planned to use it to bind him. Sure enough, he let out a sharp, eerie scream in his childish voice and lunged at me. I quickly pulled out the rope and began wrapping it around him as he approached. The spirit-binding rope could temporarily restrain most ghosts, but in the struggle, I lost some hair. The boy initially screamed loudly, which attracted his family. When Mr. Wei saw me tying up the boy, he roared in anger, "What are you doing?" He shoved me onto the bed, looking ready to hit me. Knowing I couldn't afford to explain too much, I shouted, "The child is possessed by a ghost." The moment others rushed into the room, the child fainted. Mr. Wei, hearing my shout, slowly lowered his fist. Just as I was relieved to have dodged his punch, the child woke up. Mr. Wei squatted beside the child, untying the red string from his body, and asked, "Mumu, what happened?" It seemed the child's name was Mumu. The boy coughed twice, still shaken, and said, "Big sister was hanging by the bed just now. She told me to hit this uncle because he's the one who made her like this." I was completely baffled. The Shue family, knowing this was my first visit, didn't believe a word of what the child said. They speculated that Mumu must have been dreaming, missing his sister so much that he experienced some bizarre hallucinations or even sleepwalking. Being well-versed in paranormal matters, I suspected there was more to this, something mysterious I couldn't quite put into words at that moment. Everyone returned to their rooms to continue sleeping. This time, the grandparents locked their door to prevent Mumu from running out again. I calmed myself down, deciding to get some rest before continuing my investigation the next day. Lying on my side, with my back to the wall, I tried to recapture the sleep that fear had driven away. Just as I was dozing off, I suddenly felt a faint touch on the back of my head. I opened my eyes, preparing to quickly turn around the next time I felt it. I had mentally braced myself to see something I shouldn't. Moments later, the sensation returned. I swiftly turned my head. What I saw was a pair of pale blue-white feet, hanging just inches from my eyelashes at the exact height of my head on the pillow. Following the feet upward, I saw a little girl with disheveled hair, her head tilted back, but her eyes staring down at me. Her tongue stuck out lifeless. It was her. It was Choo Choo. I jumped off the bed immediately, grabbing the red string from under my pillow. Standing firmly, I took another look at her. Faintly, I could see her neck bent at an odd angle, with a thick rope as wide as a thumb around it. Her bulging eyes and protruding tongue confirmed my guess. This was her deathly visage. A hanged ghost, as they were called in ancient times, referred to someone who died by hanging. Because their death was so painful, their expressions were often twisted and terrifying. In ghost lore, the origin of the black and white impermanent spirit stems from such hanged ghosts. As Pu Songling once wrote in Strange Tales from a Chinese Studio, driven to ultimate despair, one takes one's own life. What suffering! Yet the greatest torment is not death itself, but the moment when the rope tightens and binds. This is why such ghosts remain bound to that agony, unable to let go even in death. hanged ghosts, if not guided properly after death, would inevitably turn into malicious spirits, and those who could see them were either already close to death or harbored a death wish. I had neither, yet I could see her. Did that mean I was about to die? Being an expert in the paranormal, I knew how to handle this, even though I'd never encountered it before. Quickly, I tied the red string into a noose, mimicking the rope that had killed her. Ghosts of this kind feared the object that caused their death and dreaded the thought of dying again. As I flung the noose at her, she vanished. I knew I hadn't destroyed her. She would come for me again. It was just a matter of time. I turned on the lights, hurriedly packed my belongings into a bag I could grab at a moment's notice, and sat crouched in the corner, both thinking and staying alert, waiting for dawn. During the next few hours, countless thoughts raced through my mind. Choo Choo Moo Moo and me, we weren't connected in any way. Why had Choo Choo's ghost targeted me? Didn't she know I was here to help her? I couldn't figure it out. As the first light of dawn appeared on the horizon, I suddenly felt a sharp, stabbing pain on my back, ears, and palms. It was as if needles were being driven into me, and I rolled on the floor in agony, drenched in sweat. Amidst the chaos, a thought flashed in my mind, a realization. I could finally piece everything together, but I needed to confirm it. However, everything happening seemed to be a warning to mind my own business and leave immediately. I staggered out of the room, pounding on the Shue family's door. Ms. Shue, Mr. Wei, I can't do this. I'm sorry, I have to go. I shouted. Without waiting for response, I ran back the way I came. About half a mile away, the pain abruptly disappeared. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. I now understood the entire situation, but I couldn't resolve it alone. I needed help, and fast. If I delayed any longer, Moo Moo would be the next to die. No, I couldn't let anyone else die. I'm no hero, but I'm not a coward either. If I can't handle it myself, I'll find someone who can. And you'd better believe I'll make sure this ends, because one way or another you're going down. I leaned against the dirt slope by the side of the path, fished out a cigarette from my bag, lit it, and took a drag. Then, without much thought, I pulled out my phone and dialed a seasoned elder in our field. Among the people I know who are still alive and active, he's the only one who could decisively bring this matter to a close. Let me share my thoughts on this case. The mysterious sect I mentioned earlier is divided into two schools, the Qi sect and the Yi sect. The former focuses on practicing Qigong and spreading Taoist teachings, while the latter specializes in strange techniques and acts as enforcers of divine will. Originally a Taoist offshoot, its patriarch was Tao Hongjing, and they worshipped Lu Dongbin. The sect thrived from the late Han to the mid-Tang dynasty, but began declining during the early Song dynasty. By the late Song dynasty, due to repeated Mongol invasions, many members abandoned the Taoist path. The remaining few split into factions, each pursuing their own version of the truth. During the Yuan dynasty, when the Mongols consolidated religious forces, one faction aligned with the court, choosing non-resistance to develop. This evolved into today's Qi sect, which chants Taoist scriptures daily and adopts a passive, non-intrusive stance toward the world. However, it gradually lost the Taoist spirit of concern for the nation's well-being. Meanwhile, those who opposed the court retreated to the grassroots, forming what is now the Yi sect. Due to their constant resistance to foreign forces, Yi sect members became elusive. Early on, they inherited many unique skills and techniques, which allowed them to remain hidden in cities and towns, forming numerous small subsects. These groups became known for healing, exorcising demons, and driving away evil spirits. Their expertise in talismans and spells far surpassed contemporary Taoist practices like those of Wudong or Quanjin. However, some members engaged in wrongdoing, tarnishing their reputation. Despite their many good deeds, people only remembered their misdeeds. In 1970, the Qi sect's leader called for a reunion of all Taoist branches, held a ceremony to honor their ancestors, and reformed the sect into a unified entity. Still, many independent practitioners scattered across the country refused to rejoin, leaving the public wary of them. Over time, Much of the Esek's original martial knowledge was lost, leaving only talismans, incantations, and puppet magic. However, these remaining practices could still cause harm in secret. This allowed unscrupulous individuals to exploit them, further instilling fear among people. Although technically part of the Taoist tradition, these individuals often acted outside its rules, making them difficult to control. Their mysterious nature meant that by the time you discovered their misdeeds, it might already be too late for you. When Mumu pulled my hair at the Shui household, I began experiencing mysterious pain. This was a clear sign someone had used my hair in a clay puppet to cast a spell on me. It's easy to differentiate this. If someone had cursed the Shui family to ruin them, I wouldn't have been affected since I'm not a member of the Shui family. My survival indicated two possibilities. First, the caster's skill wasn't sufficient, and my own protective talismans hindered their attack. Second, they didn't intend to kill me but wanted to warn me off, making it clear I shouldn't meddle further. I'm inclined to believe the first possibility because it makes my revenge all the more satisfying. When Chu Chu hanged herself, I knew something was off. As I mentioned, even in death, she had no reason to specifically mesmerize her brother on the seventh night. If her brother had reached the door latch that night, their mother would have faced another breakdown the next day. Chu Chu died by hanging, and anyone who sees a spirit like that is usually near death themselves. On the 14th day after Chu Chu's death, I visited their home. My presence clearly pressured the mastermind behind this, as Chu Chu's brother saw her ghost again that night. Following this, I was attacked, and my hair was pulled, a premeditated act meant to cast a spell on me later. Furthermore, Chu Chu's ghost appeared behind me, swaying like a hanged person and kicking the back of my head to make me turn around. This indicated that the caster intended to kill me. Otherwise, they wouldn't have needed to command Chu Chu's ghost to scare me. There were less drastic ways to make me back off. After being cursed, I suddenly recalled the ox bone talisman in Mr. Wei's car with its inscribed spells. It all clicked. I had seen this spell before in Guangxi when I was apprenticing under my master. While traveling from Liuzhou to Guilin, we resolved a case for a family and found the spell carved on a walnut tree in their yard. My master told me the story of ghost-drawn peach talismans and warned me to stay away from people who used such spells. They're insidious, and if they catch you interfering, you'll never see it coming. This spell, originally meant for exorcism, is typically hung in homes or worn for protection. Only practitioners of a specific sect branch could wield it. I should have slapped myself for forgetting my master's words. The sect doesn't train female disciples, so Shui's sister and grandmother are excluded. Among the grandfather Mumu and Mr. Wei, it all pointed to the latter. Once I connected the dots, it became clear that Mr. Wei, who understands sect Taoist practices, was the mastermind behind everything. He likely kept some of Chu Chu's hair or personal belongings during the spring festival and used puppet magic to manipulate her into hanging herself in a pigsty. The pigsty, being filthy and damp, would trap her soul with miasma, preventing it from leaving. Once she died, he conveniently returned to the Shui household, used an excuse to step out briefly, and captured her ghost. Such methods serve two purposes: using the ghost to commit misdeeds, or refining it into a spirit for life extension. Since Mumu saw her ghost on the seventh day, it wasn't just about committing crimes. Chu Chu's spirit alone would have sufficed for that. He must have been using it to extend his own life. This implies he had committed heinous acts in the past, shortening his lifespan. It's evident he befriended the Shui family, knowing they had 2 children, carefully gaining their trust to execute his plan. I hoped my escape hadn't raised his suspicions. Over the phone, I gave a rough account of what happened to an elder I knew, Master Situ. Although Master Situ was someone who loved money, he had a strong sense of justice. Without hesitation, he told me, "Wait for me at the town entrance. I'll be there soon." I got up, found a motorcycle at the village entrance, and hitched a ride to the town to wait for him. Master Situ, with years of experience on the road, had accumulated significant wealth, which was evident from the imposing Range Rover he drove. When he stepped out of the car, I noticed he wasn't wearing his usual robe. That made sense. Keeping a low profile was necessary. I got into the car and gave him directions to a spot where we could see the Shue family home from a distance. Sita turned to me and said, "Now you take my car and drive back to Chongqing. Stop somewhere midway and wait for my call." "What? I came all this way to see how you handle this guy, and now you're telling me to leave?" I protested. Situ explained, "From what you've told me, this man isn't local. He must have set up an altar somewhere in the city where he operates. If we don't find and destroy that altar, even if the boy's life is saved, the girl's soul will never be free." His words made the situation sound even graver. Taking the risk, I floored the gas pedal, speeding up to 140 kilometers per hour. After all, it wasn't my car, so any speeding tickets wouldn't come back to haunt me. When I got off the highway and neared Guanyin Bridge, Master Sitta called. "It's done," he said, his voice slightly breathless. I must have missed quite the showdown. He continued, "Go directly to the road behind Laziba, the one leading up to Ealing. There's an auto part shop there. The shop is currently empty. Break the lock. The altar is inside." Breaking into a shop in broad daylight? I thought I'd end up in a holding cell before I even managed to open the door. But I still drove to the location. Conveniently, there was a locksmith just around the corner. I approached the locksmith and said, "I'm a friend of Boss Wei." He lost his keys and asked me to get the door open for him. The locksmith was skeptical at first. I added, "Boss Wei's girlfriend's last name is Shue. Does that ring a bell?" That seemed to convince him. Still, he was professional enough to hand me a photocopy of his ID and a record with a police filing number before he opened the lock. To my annoyance, I had to pay for the service myself. Once inside, I locked the door, turned on the lights, and began searching. On my way in, I couldn't resist flipping off the surveillance camera in the corner. The shop was about 100 square feet. Judging by the shape of the ceiling, it had once been a bomb shelter before being converted into a storefront. In the back, I found a small opening, and inside it, the altar. The space was dimly lit by a small yellow incandescent bulb. Next to it was a makeshift toilet. Opposite the toilet, in the corner of the wall, stood a shrine table. On the table were 3 small cups. The left cup held unhulled rice, the right one had cinnabar, and the middle one contained nail clippings. Beneath the nail clippings was a sticky, greenish substance resembling mung bean cake. Directly in front of the middle cup was a bronze censer. But instead of incense or ash, it was filled with a tangled mass of hair. I picked it up, long strands of a young girl's hair. This must have been Choo Choo's hair, torn off by Wei after exhuming her body on the 7th day, while Ms. Shue was unconscious. Beside the censer lay a clay figurine. Its hands and feet were broken off. Underneath each of the cups on the shrine table was a piece of yellow talisman paper scrawled with crooked symbols. One of them was familiar. It was used to control spirits, just like the ones pasted on zombies' foreheads in classic horror films. The floor was covered with red wax marks, densely packed in a semicircle around the shrine table. On the wall behind it hung a portrait of Zhong Kuei, the demon slayer. The eerie setup painted a vivid image in my mind. Wei pacing around, chanting incantations by candlelight, his face twisted with malice. The thought alone sent chills down my spine. There was no phone signal inside, so I stepped outside to call Master Situ. I described the altar to him. He sighed and instructed me. Burn the talismans in the order of left, right, and center. Soak the clay figurine in water and grind it into powder. Swap the contents of the left and right cups and pour them on the shrine table. Smash the cups, then bring the censer and the middle cup to me. Oh, and before you leave, urinate on the prayer mat. It took me 10 minutes to summon the urge, but I followed his instructions, wrapped the censer and cup securely, and drove back to town. By the time I returned, it was still before noon. I knew Master Situ had dealt with Wei, so I went straight to the Shue family home, feeling elated. When I knocked on the door and entered, Master Situ quickly shut it behind me. I saw Wei standing on the table in the living room, shirtless, with his hands tied above his head to a ceiling beam. His feet were also bound. His body and face were covered in mud and scratches, clearly inflicted by a woman. After I left, Sita must have subdued him and told the Shue family the truth. Ms. Shue was undoubtedly furious. Letting him live was already merciful. Though weakened, Wei was still conscious. I climbed onto the table and slapped him hard across the face, avenging myself for the curse he had placed on me. The only people in the room were Master Situ, me, Grandpa, and Wei. Grandma had taken Ms. Shue and Mumu to a separate room to calm them down. Grandpa, tears streaming down his face, was trembling with rage. Once I got off the table, Master Situ filled. Clearly, Mr. Wei never expected me to bring such a powerful helper. He thought I had already run away and dared not get involved anymore. So, when Master Situ pretended to ask for directions at the Shue family's house, he took the opportunity to use their restroom. Inside, Master Situ cast a spell on Mr. Wei. As for the exact method, I don't know and can't ask, but it caused Mr. Wei to experience the same pain I was feeling. When he realized that someone powerful was involved and tried to flee, Master Situ called upon the Ghostbind's spell, making him trip and fall after a few steps, rendering him unable to escape. Called it ghost? Did you call out Choo-Choo's ghost? I asked, surprised. Master Situ smiled smugly and said, "No, I called out the ghost of Choo-Choo and Mumu's father, who died in a car accident a few years ago." I was shocked. If I were to call out their father's ghost, I'd first need to find his grave or something of his from his lifetime. And even then, I could only ask questions, not demand anything, and definitely not ask him to help me deal with bad people. This made me respect Master Situ even more, especially after the incident at the Grand Bridge. Master Situ didn't explain everything to me in detail, as it wasn't really any of my business. So, I still don't know how he managed to call Choo-Choo's father's soul to help. Master Situ told me that while chasing after Mr. Wei, he felt Choo-Choo's ghost attacking him. As a result, he had no choice but to temporarily seal Choo-Choo's ghost in his linglong bag until he subdued Mr. Wei. The Shue family was stunned. At first, they thought Mr. Wei was some kind of fugitive and that Master Situ was a plainclothes cop. Later, after they dragged him back to their house and tied him up, Master Situ finally revealed the whole truth. As soon as he finished speaking, Mr. Wei's body bore many more injuries. I asked Master Situ what would happen to Choo-Choo's soul now. He explained, "The iron weight you saw under his altar is used to anchor the soul, forcing it to remain in place without moving. The millet is for feeding, cinnabar is used for casting spells, and the broken clay figurines are to bind Choo-Choo's soul tightly." Then Master Situ said, "Choo-Choo's soul can be sent away. Did you bring the incense burner and the cup like I asked?" I said I had, so I went to grab them from the door. When I returned, I placed them on the floor in front of him. He instructed me to smell the cup and tell him what it smelled like. I picked it up and sniffed. It was foul, like something damp and moldy. I asked Master Situ, "What is this? Why does it smell so bad?" He replied, "This is the plaque from Choo-Choo's tongue after she hanged herself, scraped off from her tongue." The world fell silent again. If it weren't for the fact that Master Situ is someone I deeply respect, I would have shoved that plaque into his mouth to calm him down for making me smell it deliberately and not telling me what it was. Master Situ explained that the plaque appeared due to the internal heat in the body, which is associated with fire. To create such a death-binding spirit, it must be done at a time of extreme yin energy. That's why Mr. Wei had planned it for the days between the Lunar New Year and the Spring Festival, when the balance between yin and yang shifts. Choo-Choo, a girl buried in a red dress, was in a place of extreme yin energy. After 7 days of exposure, each 7th day became a crucial yin point in the ghost realm, with her being hung in a pigsty and the altar set up outside a damp restroom. All meant to keep her soul in an environment of extreme yin. Master Siddha said, "It's a good thing you told me today. If you had overlooked it, Mumu would have died on the next 7th day." After hearing this from Master Situ, I was filled with so much hatred for the man in front of me that I almost wanted to slap him again. Here is the translation based on your request. An eye for an eye is the long-standing rule when it comes to murder. However, if we were to hand him over to the police, he would have countless ways to justify his actions. Even if the Shue family, along with myself and Master Situ, testified the police wouldn't accept our words as evidence to open a case. However, releasing him would be unacceptable. If we kept him locked up, we could be arrested for illegal detention and other charges. So, when I asked Master Situ how we should handle this man, he told me he had already contacted the higher-ups in his sect who would come to take him away. They would decide what to do with him, whether it be using the sect's methods of discipline or imprisoning him in a Taoist cave to let him face his fate. Since Mr. Wei had used their sect's Taoist practices, they had to take responsibility for such a disciple. During the following days, I acted as Master Situ's messenger, communicating with the Xue family about what would happen to Mr. Wei. Eventually, they agreed to let Master Situ take him away. It was tragic for that family. They had found the true murderer of their loved ones, but with no proof, couldn't avenge their death. Instead, they were left with the guilt of being accused of murder, having no choice but to silently bear the pain, helpless. This is the only regret I have about the whole situation. By the time someone from Mr. Wei's sect arrived, it was almost midnight. As Mr. Wei was taken away, Sister Xue approached him, grabbed his hand, and slapped him hard across the face. The slap seemed to say, "I was so wrong to trust you." Then, she bit down on his arm in anger. She bit so hard, but halfway through, she cried and released him, collapsing to the ground. Before leaving, Master Situ told the Xue family, "Even if there's some disrespect, you should at least find a proper burial site for Chu-Chu and bury her well. The custom of unmarked graves only brings harm. Don't worry about Chu-Chu's soul. I will treat her with respect." On the way back to Chongqing, I asked Master Situ what would become of Chu-Chu's soul. He sighed and said, "I plan to take care of her for now. Once her 5 elements are in balance, and she is no longer in a state of extreme yin, I will guide her to the next stage." I understood Master Situ's meaning and also understood that he wanted me to ultimately take on the responsibility of seeing her off. More than a month later, I learned that Sister Xue's family had properly buried Chu-Chu. Master Situ then said that Chu-Chu was ready to be guided. So, Master Situ and I, beneath the Jiahua Bridge, gave this poor child a proper farewell. There are many mysterious forces in this world that we may never fully understand. It's best not to provoke them, or we might regret it. Later, I learned from Master Situ that Mr. Wei had died. As for how he died, I won't tell you. And with that, the story ends. In fact, every industry has people like Mr. Wei. As the saying goes, a single rotten apple spoils the whole barrel. As I mentioned at the beginning, because of their profession, this group of people can easily commit heinous acts without the law being able to restrain them or even detect it. Take, for example, the notorious red uniform boy case. He was found hanging in his home for no reason, with weights tied to his feet and a needle mark on his forehead. This kind of death couldn't have been self-inflicted. The true culprit may still be at large. How many more people like Mr. Wei are out there committing murder for money? We don't know. But as the saying goes, those who do evil will meet their end. That saying is absolutely true. Thank you for watching. If you're interested in this program, please follow my channel. See you next time.